The sky was clear and the sun shone bright over the horizon. The plane carried more than 100 passengers, each with their own plans. Some heading for work, some for vacations, and others just eager to meet loved ones. Inside the cabin there was laughter, quiet conversations, and the soft hum of engines that gave comfort to everyone on board. It felt like just another ordinary flight, safe and routine. Among those passengers sat a 22-year-old, calm but alert. Unlike others who relaxed into their seats, he often glanced toward the windows and listened closely to the sound of the engines. He had a reason. A few years back, he had started learning flight training at a local airfield. It was nothing official, not a license yet, but enough to give him knowledge of controls, instruments, and emergency procedures. He never thought it would matter on a big passenger jet. For him, it was just a hobby that made him feel alive. The flight began smoothly. Attendants served drinks, children played, and many passengers leaned back with headphones on. The young man kept thinking about his journey, about how life at 22 was full of dreams but also heavy with questions. He wondered if his small passion for flying would ever become something bigger. Maybe one day he would become a real pilot. But for now he was just one of the many passengers. About an hour into the flight, everything changed. It started with a strange sound, a vibration that did not match the usual rhythm of the engines. At first people did not notice, but he did. His ears had grown trained from spending hours near small planes. He frowned, sat up straighter, and kept listening. Then came a sudden jolt. The plane shook slightly and passengers gasped. A few laughed nervously, thinking it was just turbulence. But the young man knew the difference. Turbulence had a rhythm. This was sharp and uneven. He looked around, saw the flight attendants exchanging worried glances. Their smiles seemed forced now. Moments later, the captain's voice came over the speakers, but it wasn't steady. It trembled as he explained that the plane was experiencing technical trouble. People froze, some held their children tighter. Others whispered prayers under their breath. Fear spread through the cabin like fire. The young man's heart raced. He was not a hero, not a professional pilot, just a trainee. But his mind instantly went into training mode. He began recalling the lessons he had learned, how to handle engine failures, what the instruments meant, how a pilot should stay calm when everything felt out of control. He reminded himself of the one golden rule his instructor always repeated. Panic never fixes the plane, calm thinking does. As the plane lost altitude, the oxygen masks dropped. Passengers screamed, some cried loudly. Chaos filled the air. Yet in the middle of all that noise, the 22-year-old's mind grew strangely quiet. He felt fear, yes, but stronger than fear was a deep sense that he had to do something. He could not sit back and wait. He unbuckled his seatbelt slowly. He knew if he acted too quickly, he might draw unnecessary attention. The attendants were rushing up and down, trying to calm people. One of them stopped near him, telling him to stay seated. But he leaned closer and whispered that he had flight training. Her eyes widened, unsure whether to believe him or not. Still, the urgency in his tone made her pause. The plane shuddered again, dropping lower. The captain's voice cracked through the speakers, now clearly distressed. He admitted that one of the engines had failed and the other was under strain. A few passengers cried out. Others buried their faces in their hands. The cabin felt like a storm of fear and despair. The attendant returned, this time speaking quickly. She asked the young man to come forward. The decision had been made. The cockpit needed every bit of help it could get. He nodded, stood up, and began walking down the aisle. All eyes followed him. Some passengers looked at him with desperate hope, others with disbelief. A young man, barely in his 20s, was heading toward the cockpit to face what even experienced pilots feared. He entered the narrow space of the cockpit. The sight froze him for a second. The captain's forehead was dripping with sweat. The co-pilot was frantically trying to manage controls. Warning alarms flashed on the panels. The air smelled of metal and tension. It was chaos, yet behind that chaos was a fragile thread, holding the plane in the sky. The captain glanced at him with a mix of desperation and doubt. The young man quickly explained, "I have flight training, small planes, but I know basics. I can help." There was no time to question, no time to argue. The captain gave a quick nod, and in that moment, the 22-year-old became more than just a passenger. He became part of the crew. His hands trembled as he sat down behind the co-pilot. Every sound felt louder, every second heavier. The lives of more than 100 passengers were now tied to what happened in this small space. He swallowed his fear and focused. He remembered his instructor's voice again. Trust the instruments, trust yourself, and so, the battle to save the plane had begun. The young man sat just behind the co-pilot's seat. His heart pounded so hard he could feel it in his throat. The flashing lights on the dashboard looked like signals from another world. Alarms screamed, warning about altitude, speed, and pressure. The cabin behind them echoed faint cries, but inside the cockpit, there was only the sharp sound of survival. The captain gripped the control column tightly. His hands were steady, but his voice betrayed the weight of responsibility. The co-pilot read numbers fast, his eyes moving across instruments that seemed to show more problems than solutions. One engine was gone, the other was weakening, and the plane was too heavy to glide safely for long. The 22-year-old leaned forward. Forcing his voice to stay calm, he told them about his training, about the drills he had practiced for emergencies. He did not pretend to be more than he was, but he knew enough to help. The captain gave a short nod, a silent acceptance that even a little knowledge could mean the difference between life and death. The co-pilot pointed to the checklist, a long set of steps for emergencies. His hands shook, but he continued reading. The young man began repeating instructions, keeping his tone steady. He had practiced this on small planes, but never imagined his voice would guide actions inside a commercial jet. Behind them, the cries grew louder. Passengers knew the danger was real. The oxygen masks swung from the ceiling, a reminder that the thin air outside could not save them. A mother tried to hush her child. An old man clutched his chest. Prayers spilled from trembling lips. Yet in the cockpit, the world shrank to numbers, levers, and choices. The young man noticed the altimeter. They were losing altitude faster than safe. He pointed it out, his words sharp but clear. The captain responded with a quick movement, adjusting controls to steady the descent. It worked slightly. The fall slowed, though not enough. But in a crisis, even a small gain was a victory. "Think glide," the young man whispered. His instructor's voice echoed in his head. Planes were not only machines with engines, they were wings. Wings that could catch air if guided with precision. The captain understood at once. He adjusted the nose of the plane, balancing between stall and survival. The co-pilot's voice cracked as he reported their distance from the nearest airport. Too far. The runway they needed was miles beyond what one failing engine could promise. The cockpit fell into silence for a second. Silence heavier than the alarms. Then the young man spoke again. His words carried a strange confidence that surprised even him. He reminded them of emergency landings he had studied. He explained that sometimes highways, open fields, or even water had saved planes. The captain met his eyes, seeing not just a boy but someone refusing to give up. The plane shook again, dropping suddenly before stabilizing. Gasps erupted from the cabin. A flight attendant burst into the cockpit for an update. Her eyes darted between the three men. Hoping for reassurance, the captain gave a short answer. "We're working on it." She nodded, though her fear was plain, and hurried back to calm the passengers. Every second stretched like an eternity. The young man gripped the back of the co-pilot's chair, whispering the lessons that had been drilled into him during training. "Aviate, navigate, communicate," he said it softly but firmly. The captain repeated the words under his breath, focusing on flying first, talking second. The young man pointed out wind direction from the instruments. If they could use the wind, they could stretch the glide. It was basic knowledge. But it mattered. The captain adjusted. The plane steadied again. Still fear crept in. The young man looked at the captain's weary eyes and realized the burden he carried. More than 100 souls waited for his decisions, yet here, in this storm of pressure, they stood together. 3 men fighting the sky. For a brief moment, the alarm stopped. The sudden quiet was chilling, like the calm before a deeper fall. The captain checked the gauges again, his shoulders stiffened. The second engine was losing power faster than they expected. A final warning blinked across the panel. The co-pilot's voice broke. "We might not make it to the airport." The words were heavy, like stones dropped into water. The young man swallowed hard. He knew it was true. He had read enough crash reports to understand. But he also knew one thing. Giving up was never an option. He leaned closer to the captain, his voice low but filled with determination. "Then we make our own runway." The captain's tired eyes sparked with something new. A hint of courage returning, he nodded once, short and sharp. The cockpit was filled with a tense silence broken only by alarms and heavy breathing. The captain held the controls steady. The co-pilot scanned the instruments, and the young man searched the horizon through the small window. Every second mattered. The second engine was coughing, stuttering, as if it too was struggling to breathe. The captain spoke in a low voice, saying the airport was still too far. The co-pilot quickly checked the maps. Shaking his head, they needed a new plan. The young man leaned forward, his eyes darting between the sky and the controls. His training was basic, but survival had no rule book. Sometimes instinct was all a person had, Fields. The young man whispered. We need open ground. His voice was calm, though inside his chest his heart hammered. He remembered stories of small planes making emergency landings on grass strips, even though this aircraft was massive. The principle was the same. A flat space, no obstacles, just somewhere to bring the machine down. The co-pilot scanned their location. He spotted highways below, long stretches of road cutting through farmland. But cars moved along them like small silver dots. Landing there would be deadly unless the road could be cleared. They shook their heads. Then the young man noticed something further out. A large flat patch, brown and wide. It looked like farmland after harvest. He leaned closer to the cockpit glass, pointing toward it. The captain followed his gaze, squinting. The co-pilot checked the distance. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than nothing. The captain hesitated. The risk was enormous. A field was uneven. It could flip the aircraft, break the landing gear, tear the fuselage. But the alternative was worse. Losing altitude without a target meant certain disaster. He exhaled sharply as if releasing fear from his lungs. We go for it, he said. The co-pilot began working on procedures, shutting down unnecessary systems, transferring what little power they had left to essentials. Lights dimmed in the cabin. Some passengers gasped as the plane grew darker. For them, it was another sign of doom, but inside the cockpit, it was focus. Every watt of energy directed toward survival. The young man steadied his own breath. His hands trembled against the seat, but his mind refused to surrender. He remembered the rule. Fly the plane first, he repeated it softly, reminding them all to focus only on what they could control. Behind the cockpit door, the cabin was a storm of emotions. Some passengers wept quietly, others clutched each other. One attendant moved down the aisle, speaking softly, telling them to stay calm. She knew the truth. No one felt calm, but words were the only anchor left. The captain lowered the nose slightly, aligning the aircraft with the distant field. The horizon tilted, and passengers screamed as the plane shifted. The young man kept his voice steady, guiding where he could, calling out altitude numbers, small reminders, simple words that helped keep focus. The second engine sputtered again. It was dying. They had minutes, maybe less. The co-pilot muttered coordinates into the radio, trying to alert anyone listening. Emergency landing attempt, he said. His voice cracked, but he finished the message. Somewhere out there, towers and controllers heard, powerless to help, but aware of the fight above the earth. The field grew larger in the window. Once it had looked distant. Now it rushed toward them with terrifying speed. The captain tightened his grip. The co-pilot braced. The young man swallowed hard, whispering a silent prayer even as he kept his eyes on the instruments. Suddenly the plane jolted again. A loud bang echoed, and the right engine went completely silent. The entire jet shook, the co-pilot shouted, his voice rising with panic. The captain barked orders, steady but urgent. They were now flying with no engine, only wings gliding. Gasps and cries from the cabin grew louder. People knew. They felt the silence of the dead engine. The humming they had trusted was gone. Replaced by eerie stillness, a child screamed, and the sound pierced through the walls of fear. The young man leaned forward, speaking fast now, reminding them of the glide ratio, of how far they could stretch with the current altitude. His voice shook but carried conviction. He believed, and that belief mattered. The captain nodded, focusing again. The aircraft sank lower. Fields, rivers, and houses came into view closer now. The captain adjusted course slightly. Aiming for the open ground, the co-pilot called out airspeed. The young man whispered, hold steady, hold steady. Every second was sharper than the last. Sweat dripped down faces, hearts pounded. Lives waited in silence. Outside, the field stretched wide. Closer and closer. For the first time, hope and fear stood side by side in that cockpit. And then, with the world rushing toward them, the captain pulled the plane into alignment. The young man gripped the seat with all his strength. The co-pilot braced. The passengers held their breath. The field was waiting. The landing was seconds away. The aircraft glided lower and lower, its body trembling as if every bolt and rivet understood the danger. The hum of engines, once a comfort, had vanished. Now there was only the sound of rushing wind outside and the heavy breathing inside. The captain's knuckles turned white as he gripped the control column. The co-pilot read numbers from the panel, his voice tight. The young man leaned forward, eyes locked on the field that stretched in the distance. It looked close yet far, like hope hidden behind layers of fear. Inside the cabin, panic rose. Passengers clutched hands, whispered prayers, some cried openly. The attendants tried to keep order, their voices steady though their eyes betrayed fear. The plane tilted slightly as the captain adjusted its nose, and shrieks filled the air. Children held onto their parents, and strangers hugged strangers. The weight of survival pressed down on everyone. The young man forced himself to breathe slowly. His body shook, but his mind fought to stay sharp. He called out reminders from training. Maintain glide, steady speed. No sudden pulls. His words sounded calm. Though his heart thundered, the captain listened, nodding once. The ground rose quickly now. Trees, rooftops, and winding roads became clearer with every passing second. The field loomed larger, but so did the obstacles around it. On one side stood a line of trees. On the other, a shallow river. The young man pointed them out, his voice urgent but clear. Left side is safer. Aim center. The captain adjusted. The co-pilot's voice cracked as he called out airspeed. Too high, he muttered, then corrected himself. Better now. The aircraft wobbled, caught in a gust of wind. For a moment it dipped too sharply. Gasps erupted from the cabin. The captain steadied it, muscles straining against the controls. The young man glanced at the passengers through the half-open cockpit door. He saw faces pale with terror, people clinging to life in their own ways. Some had shut their eyes tight. Others stared wide open, frozen. In that instant, he realized something deeper. This wasn't just about flying a plane. It was about carrying the weight of every single soul on board. The captain's voice was hoarse. Brace for landing. The co-pilot repeated the command into the cabin speakers. Panic surged, but the attendants moved quickly, shouting for passengers to tuck down, to hold tight. The cabin filled with cries, prayers, and the desperate rustle of belts tightening. The young man braced himself too. His hands gripped the seat, yet his voice did not falter. Steady, steady, he whispered to the captain. The plane was seconds from the ground. The field rushed closer. The grass looked rough, uneven, not made for a giant machine of steel and wings, yet it was the only hope. The captain pulled slightly, angling the nose upward just enough. The co-pilot held his breath. The young man shut his eyes for half a heartbeat, then forced them open again. He had to see this through. With a deafening roar of air and metal, the landing gear slammed against the field. The aircraft bounced hard. Every passenger screamed. Overhead bins rattled, bags fell. The second hit came sharper. The cabin shook violently. People were thrown forward against belts. The young man's chest slammed into the seatback. Pain shot through him, but he held on. The plane skidded across the field. Grass and dirt sprayed like waves. The wheels dug in, jerking the fuselage left and right. The captain fought the controls. The co-pilot shouted corrections. The young man pressed himself back, praying the plane would hold. It slid further, cutting through earth, leaving a scar of torn ground. The nose dipped dangerously. The tail lifted slightly. A shriek of metal echoed as one wheel snapped. Sparks flew. The passengers cried out louder. The attendants braced, shouting, "Stay down!" Their voices barely rose above the chaos. Then, after what felt like an endless storm, the plane slowed, its violent slide softened. The screech of metal turned into a dull drag. Finally, with a lurch, it stopped, tilted slightly to one side, silent except for the groan of stressed metal cooling. For a moment, no one moved. The world seemed frozen. Dust hung in the air. A bird flapped from the nearby field, as if mocking the silence of humans holding their breath. Then came the sound, a sob, then another. Relief broke like a wave. Passengers cried, laughed shakily, embraced. The young man let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. His body trembled, but his heart felt lighter. He looked at the captain, whose face was pale with exhaustion. The co-pilot's hand still shook, but all three of them were alive, and so were the passengers. The captain whispered almost to himself, We made it. The young man closed his eyes for a moment, letting the words sink in. It wasn't over yet. Smoke hissed from one wheel. Alarms still blinked faintly, but they had done what seemed impossible. They had brought a falling plane to the ground. In that silence, hope returned, fragile but real. The plane rested tilted on the rough field, its wheels buried in the torn earth. A faint hiss of smoke rose from one side, the smell of burnt metal and soil mixing in the air. Inside the cabin, the silence was heavy, broken only by the sound of sobs, gasps, and nervous laughter that escaped from trembling lips. The young man pressed his back against the seat, his hands shaking. His chest hurt from the impact, but he was alive. He turned his head slightly and saw passengers clinging to each other. Some were crying openly, others frozen as if their minds still hadn't caught up with what had just happened. The attendants moved quickly, voices sharp but calm. "Stay seated, stay calm. Wait for instructions," they repeated. The captain exhaled heavily, his hand sliding off the control column. Sweat dripped from his brow. His shoulders slumped. The co-pilot leaned forward, covering his face with his palms. For a moment, both men looked broken, but then training took over again. They had to think beyond landing. They had to get everyone out safely. The young man forced himself to sit up straighter. His body felt heavy, as if every bone was carrying the weight of the last few minutes. He swallowed hard and looked toward the cockpit door. Behind it, 100 lives were waiting for guidance. "Evacuation," the captain muttered, his voice hoarse. The co-pilot nodded, pressing buttons to cut off fuel, to prevent sparks from turning into flames. The captain reached for the intercom. His voice echoed through the cabin. Steady but strained. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have made an emergency landing. Please remain calm. Follow crew instructions. We will begin evacuation." The words released a flood of emotions. Some passengers began crying louder. Others clapped shakily, grateful to be alive. One man whispered thank yous under his breath. Another kept repeating that it was a miracle. But beneath the relief was fear. The sight of smoke made people desperate to leave. The attendants opened the emergency exits. Bright daylight poured in, carrying with it the smell of grass and dust. Escape slides deployed with a hiss. The first brave passenger leapt, tumbling onto the uneven field before scrambling to their feet. More followed, some hesitated, staring at the height. But attendants pushed them forward firmly. "Go, go!" they shouted, urgency in every word. The young man stood slowly, his legs wobbled, but he steadied himself against the seat. A woman clutched his arm as he passed, whispering, "Thank you." Though she didn't even know his name, he gave a weak nod, unsure what to say. The aisle was chaotic. Parents carried children. Older passengers struggled. Strangers helped strangers. One man lifted a crying child and handed her down the slide. Another supported an elderly woman who could barely walk. Humanity showed itself in raw form, fear and kindness side by side. The young man stayed near the back for a while, helping where he could, guiding people toward the exits. He noticed the flight attendants working tirelessly, their faces pale but their voices strong. They pulled passengers from seats, urged them forward, and never stopped moving. Their courage was quiet but powerful. The captain was the last to leave the cockpit. He moved down the aisle, checking rows. Making sure no one was left, the co-pilot followed, limping slightly from the impact. When they saw the young man still helping, they gave him a look, a mix of gratitude and disbelief. Finally, the cabin was empty. The young man slid down the escape chute. Landing hard on the field, he rolled, dirt staining his clothes, but he pushed himself up quickly. Around him, passengers gathered in a wide, shaky circle. Some hugged. Some knelt on the ground, kissing the soil. Others simply stared at the huge plane, stunned that they were still breathing. Emergency sirens wailed in the distance. Fire trucks and ambulances were racing across dirt paths toward the crash site. Rescue teams would soon take over, but for now, it was just them. The survivors standing in the shadow of the giant machine that had nearly become their grave. The young man stood quietly. His chest rose and fell with each shaky breath. People glanced at him, some with tears of gratitude, some with awe. They didn't know his name, but they knew he had been in the cockpit. They had seen him walk forward when the world seemed to be ending. One attendant approached, placing a hand on his shoulder. Her eyes were wet but steady. "You helped save them," she whispered. The words hit him harder than the landing. His throat tightened. He had never thought of himself as a hero. He was just a trainee, just a passenger, yet here he was, standing with lives that might have been lost. The captain walked over too, his face pale but his voice strong. "You did more than anyone expected," he said. His hand rested firmly on the young man's arm. A gesture of respect. The co-pilot nodded, eyes still filled with disbelief. Around them, the passengers began cheering. Not loud or wild, but broken, shaky claps that grew into something stronger. It was relief, it was gratitude, it was life. The young man lowered his head, overwhelmed. He didn't know how to carry such praise, but deep down, he knew one thing: he had faced the sky and lived. The field was no longer just dirt and grass. It was the place where hope had landed, fragile but alive. The survivors stood in the field as rescue sirens grew louder. Paramedics rushed in. Fire crews sprayed water over the smoking wheels, and officials guided passengers away from the tilted plane. The once terrifying silence was replaced with the busy noise of survival. People were checked for injuries, wrapped in blankets, and seated on the grass while medics moved from one person to another. The young man sat quietly on the edge of the crowd. His clothes were dusty, his hands scraped. His body ached from the rough landing, but his mind was heavier than the pain. He watched families reunite, parents hugging children, friends embracing with tears. They were alive, and that was all that mattered. Yet he also knew this day was no longer just their secret. The world would soon hear about it. Within an hour, reporters arrived, their cameras pointed at the field, microphones ready. They pushed forward, asking questions. Desperate for stories, survivors spoke in shaky voices, describing the terror, the prayers. The moment the plane slammed into the earth again and again, one detail surfaced: a young passenger who had gone into the cockpit. Who had helped? The attendants confirmed it. Speaking with soft but firm words, they told reporters how the young man had offered his training, how he had guided steps during the chaos. The captain himself, still pale and exhausted, told them plainly. He made a difference. The co-pilot nodded silently, his eyes still carrying the weight of disbelief. Suddenly, the cameras turned to the young man. A crowd formed, questions fired like arrows. "What's your name? How did you know what to do? Did you think you were going to die?" He blinked under the lights, his throat dry. For a moment, he didn't know how to speak. He had never wanted attention, never imagined he would be the center of a story that spanned more than 100 lives. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft but steady. He told them he had some flight training, just enough to understand the basics. He explained that he only wanted to help, that the real heroes were the crew who fought until the very end. His words were humble, almost too simple, but they carried weight. Reporters scribbled furiously. Cameras clicked. His image spread beyond the field. By evening, news channels across the country showed the plane lying broken in the field, yet with a headline that read, "Young passenger helps save flight." Social media filled with posts, videos from survivors, shaky recordings of the landing, voices shouting in terror, followed by cheers of relief. In the middle of it all was the young man, captured in pictures, walking calmly to the cockpit when others froze in fear. Back at a nearby hospital, survivors rested under care. Some had bruises, others minor injuries, but there were no deaths. Doctors called it miraculous. The passengers called it a blessing. Families wept with gratitude, and among their whispered thanks, the young man's name kept surfacing, spoken with respect, spoken with awe. He sat alone in a waiting area, away from the noise. His hands still trembled. His thoughts ran wild. He replayed the moment when the engine died, the jolt of the landing, the cries in the cabin. He kept asking himself if he had truly done enough, if luck had carried them more than skill. Yet every time his doubt grew, he remembered the captain's voice saying, "You made a difference." Later that night, the passengers gathered together. Some limped, some leaned on crutches, but all stood to share a quiet moment. One by one, they walked up to him, thanking him, shaking his hand. Some hugged him without words, tears streaming down their faces. He felt overwhelmed, but he didn't push them away. He realized their gratitude was not just for him, but for the miracle of survival itself. Meanwhile, the news reached far beyond the field. Across cities and towns, people spoke of the story. A young person, barely into adulthood, had stepped into the cockpit during disaster, not because he was ordered, but because he refused to sit and watch others die. It inspired conversations about courage, about training, about how ordinary people can rise in extraordinary moments. The young man returned to his family later that night. Their embrace was fierce, tears flowed freely. They had feared the worst when the news first broke. To see him alive was enough, but to learn what he had done left them speechless, his mother whispered. You gave people back to their families, and those words settled deep in his heart. That night, as the world buzzed with headlines and voices, he lay awake staring at the ceiling. His body was safe in bed, but his mind was still in the cockpit. He could still hear the alarms, feel the vibration of the falling plane, and see the faces of those who had trusted him without question. He knew life would never be the same again. Days passed, yet the memory of the flight lingered like a shadow that refused to leave. News outlets continued to cover the story, showing images of the broken plane in the field, replaying interviews with survivors, and retelling how a 22-year-old passenger had stepped into the cockpit when everything seemed lost. Across the world, people spoke of courage. Some called him a hero, others said he had been placed there by fate. The young man, however, struggled with the weight of it all. He never asked for fame, never sought recognition. He had only done what felt necessary. Still, everywhere he went, people stared. Some approached him with gratitude, others with curiosity. His name was on headlines, his face on screens. Yet inside he felt the same as before, uncertain, ordinary, a person who simply loved flying. He returned to his training airfield one morning. The small planes stood neatly in a row, their engines silent. He ran his hand along the cool metal of one aircraft. The memories rushed back, the sound of alarms, the cries of passengers, the trembling controls in the captain's hands. He closed his eyes, breathing deeply. This place had once been his escape. Now it felt like the beginning of something larger. His instructor greeted him warmly, shaking his hand firmly. You did something extraordinary, the older man said. The young man shook his head, replying softly, I was terrified. I just remembered what you taught me. Stay calm. Think clear. The instructor smiled gently. That's what makes the difference. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's acting in spite of it. Meanwhile, survivors continued to reach out. Letters and messages poured in. Parents wrote to say thank you for saving their children. Couples shared that they had been given another chance to live together. Elderly passengers expressed gratitude for simply being able to see another sunrise. Each message touched him deeply, reminding him that the decision to stand up in that moment had changed countless lives. Yet at night, when the world was quiet, he wrestled with doubt. He remembered how close they had come to disaster. He remembered the sharp jolts, the way the ground had rushed toward them. He asked himself if it was truly skill or just luck that saved them. But then he thought of the faces of the passengers, alive and breathing, and he accepted that maybe it had been both. Officials later honored him, inviting him to a small ceremony where he stood beside the captain, the co-pilot, and the crew. Medals were given. Speeches were made. Applause filled the room as his story was told once again. The young man shifted uncomfortably in the spotlight, but when he looked at the families seated in the audience, he felt a quiet sense of peace. He hadn't done it for medals. He had done it because in that moment he couldn't do anything else. The captain later pulled him aside. His voice was low, almost emotional. You reminded me why I became a pilot, he said. In the face of fear, you chose to act, and because of that, we are all here today. The young man nodded. Words caught in his throat. Sometimes silence spoke louder than anything. In the months that followed, his life shifted. He decided to pursue his dream fully, enrolling in advanced flight training with renewed determination. Flying was no longer just a hobby, it was a calling. Every time he sat inside a cockpit, he carried the memory of that day not as a burden, but as a reminder that knowledge, courage, and calm could turn the impossible into survival. The passengers never forgot him. Some sent letters on the anniversary of the landing. Some invited him to family gatherings, others simply kept his name in their prayers. He had unknowingly become part of their lives, a symbol of hope and resilience. One evening, as the sun set behind the horizon, he stood outside watching the sky turn golden. Planes traced faint lines above, heading to destinations unknown. He smiled softly, not with pride but with understanding. He realized the sky that once terrified him now called him back, not as a place of fear, but as a place where life had given him purpose. He was only 22, but he had learned something people spend a lifetime searching for. He learned that ordinary people can rise in extraordinary moments, that fear can coexist with courage, and that sometimes a single choice can carry the weight of many lives. The world would always remember the day a passenger with flight training helped save a plane. But for him it was simpler. It was the day he discovered who he truly was, and as he looked toward the endless sky, he whispered to himself, "This is only the beginning."